Morning, guys. It's another hot day here in North Carolina. I hate the summers in North Carolina. It's just so hot all the time. Luckily this year we haven't been as hot as we have in previous years. In previous years we reached temperatures over 100 numerous times throughout the summer. Luckily we're past the peak and we still haven't hit 100. So I'm grateful for that, but I could do without the heat. Spent most of my summer in Canada. Much better climate up there. But anyway, I wanted to address something today. You know, we constantly are barraged on social media, the news, all these places with these fact-checking organizations, and they fact-check people. And the problem that I have with this is not the fact-checker themselves. I want to make that clear at the beginning of this video. The issue I have with this is this entire system, right? So you have a company like USA Today picking up on something, some random post somewhere, and then they fact-check it to discredit the person and have the post removed from social media, therefore impacting our freedom of speech, right? Everybody's entitled to an opinion. And even if that opinion doesn't necessarily have to be right or wrong. The problem that I have in this particular scenario is that the fact checker didn't even use facts to check it. All they were trying to do is just discredit it as having any fact to therefore have it removed. But in that case, USA Today should take down this article. It should be removed because the facts that are in the article, or quote unquote facts, the references used, aren't even factual. So by the same token that they should have the post removed from Facebook for this particular user, they should also remove the article from the internet, period, because it's not actually true. The title of this article, and you'll see why I took interest in this particular one, was Post Comparing Bison and Cattle Methane Emissions Does Not Pass Smell Check / Fact Check USA Today. I'm not going to get into the author's name because here's the thing is I recognize that these people are just doing a job and that their editor is saying, hey, go out and fact check this. Here's a reference for you to use. And I mean, that's what they're charged with doing, right? These people aren't experts in their own areas. There's nothing that qualifies them as a fact checker other than USA Today. And this is a flawed program. I could tell you, well, you probably already know a ton of these things that have been incorrect. This author is saying the claim that this post implies methane emissions from cattle have no environmental impact because bison gas did not cause climate change. The intro to this is hilarious, especially when you actually read what the post said, okay? So the post said, worried about cow farts, and it has this picture of a bison. In the early 1800s, there were roughly 60 million buffalo residing in America. There are currently 9.4 million dairy and 31.7 million beef cows in America. You either have to prove cow farts are more destructive to the environment than buffalo farts, or admit that cow farts really aren't something we should be worried about, reads the post. So just off the bat, the post does not imply at all that cattle have no environmental impact. Neither does the post claim that bison did not cause climate change. The only thing that the post says is that you have to prove cow farts are more destructive. In fact, that implies that buffalo farts in this post, they use the word buffalo, and we'll get to that in a second, are in fact destructive, and that they want to be proven that cow farts aren't more destructive. If I were to actually fact check this, I would say that neither one is destructive, but we'll get into that in a few minutes. The post was shared 3,000 times in 5 days before it was deleted by the fact-checking agencies. Okay, so their reading was missing context. I would say they were missing some of the context of their title to this. The implied claim here is wrong. While cows aren't the biggest source of greenhouse gases, they do still release methane into the atmosphere. He never said that they didn't, and he never said that they weren't destructive. He said, prove to me that they're not more destructive than buffalo farts. They go on to say, however, limited research suggests bison in the 1800s may have released a similar, though possibly lower, amount of methane than cattle today. There's no facts in any of this. I mean, when you have limited research and words like possibly, you're immediately coming into fact-checking something without any facts of your own. And again, the only thing that this post said was prove to me that cow farts are more destructive than buffalo farts. Mind you, he is talking about farts. Now, I do agree with what they said when they said cattle generate greenhouse gases, but not a top source. So they're admitting to the fact that cattle are not a top source of greenhouse gases. And in fact, in the fact checking, they mentioned that cattle only produce 4% of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And this has been something that has been bothering me for a while because, you know, it's been bumped up as one of the main sources of methane emissions, and so we have to do away with all the cows. 4% is a very insignificant number of greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, think about it. We all breathe out greenhouse gas emissions. So if you were trying to get to a net zero of greenhouse gas emissions in general, you'd have to do away with the population. It's only 4%. If we did away with all the cows, it wouldn't make that much of a difference. It would probably have other environmental impacts, but that's for a whole other video. So right away, they decided to kind of pick on what they felt were the obvious. They said the term buffalo is technically incorrect because buffalo are native to Asia and Africa. Now, when you talk about scientific classification and scientific names, that is actually correct. But when you talk about terminology and terminology that's been used throughout the United States throughout history, that is an incorrect assumption. You see, when explorers first came over, you had a couple different terms for these animals. And the term buffalo actually just means horned cattle or ox in French. And the term bison just meant horned cattle or ox in Greek. So you had two different languages. Well, the language that came over here was not Greek, was it? It was French. It was French, and they influenced a lot of the early communication between Native Americans and Westerners that were coming over here. So their words heavily influenced, you know, how we perceive a lot of different animals and things as we communicated with Native Americans. So the terminology for buffalo comes from that. At that point in time, there wasn't really a scientific classification for them. But you can imagine that, you know, over the years, when you have somebody saying, oh, that's a buffalo, and then you see some animal down in the water in another country, and they say, no, that's a buffalo. Eventually, or an ox, and they say, that's a buffalo. Or they call everything a bison. Either way, it creates confusion, right? So now we have scientific classification that uses specific terms for specific species. But to negate the fact and to say that it is false to call a bison a buffalo, in my opinion, is disrespectful in many ways to the Native American culture that's out there today, because a lot of them still use the term buffalo. And that's because it dates way back in time here in America, and it's been a term that is constantly used even today. Even within the bison industry, many people call it buffalo. It's a common terminology. So to fact check somebody on that, I think was far-reaching. They're obviously stretching here. And again, my issue with this is that these posts are getting censored and taken down by fact checkers who are impeding on people's free speech. And now, you know, what they said about, you know, the terminology buffalo, I think is highly disrespectful to some of the cultural languages that have been here well before colonization and their interpretation of the animal. And granted, it does come from the French, you know, but the French were some of the early communicators with them. And that has traditionally stuck with many tribes across the United States. So to just disregard that is improper. I don't think they should have even gone there. It just discredits this whole thing that they're trying to do. They also got into the focus on the rear end of these animals producing methane when it's something that comes from burps and, you know, and other gases from the ruminants. Again, this is just, they're taking technical punches at this that are unnecessary. We all know where the methane from a ruminant comes from, right? The ruminant is eating grasses, carbohydrates, it gets fermented in their stomach, and that fermentation, we'll get into that a little bit here in a second, but that fermentation creates methane. They then attempted in their best efforts, without having factual information or knowledge or conclusive scientific studies, to make it sound as though bison produce less methane than cattle. I want to make something clear here, because if we're talking about the environment, and we talk about the environment a lot on this channel, I think that there's a clear line these days between environmentalism and climatism. And that line is getting more and more divided as we go down the road, because there are a lot of things that just don't make sense environmentally that climate activists push for. For example, in was it Sweden or Scotland or one of those European countries? I'll have to go back and look at which one this was, but they recently, the estimate is that they had cut down about over 15 million trees in order to make room for wind turbines. Now, wind turbines have an impact on the environment. Every source of energy we use has an environmental trade-off, and it's not necessarily good depending on where you put that environmental trade-off. And in fact, there are cases where I would say that the extraction of oil and gas is much less invasive than putting up a wind turbine or putting out solar panels, which create heat islands. I mean, there are so many different, we don't go into this stuff, the climatism side does not go into this stuff thinking about the environment side. They go into this stuff just thinking about, how do we make an income stream off of these products that we've created and convince people that they're good for the environment. Whereas when you look at it from the environmental side, a lot of times you look at these things and say, whoa, that shouldn't go there. Like, we're screwing with the sonars of whales, So I think that there's a big line that's been kind of drawn over the years between people who actually care about the environment, have knowledge of the environment, and this climate movement. And I think that at some point, they're going to discredit themselves more they move away from that. So on that point, though, when it comes to bison, are they better for the environment? Absolutely. I think that they offer a lot of things that cattle do not offer. But when it comes to this question of, greenhouse gas emissions, are they that much different? I don't think that anything has ever been conclusive on that. And for those who are making that argument, something else you might want to look at is just how many ruminants there used to be, not just bison, but how many ruminants in general there used to be across the United States of America. When you figure the herds of elk, the herds of antelope, there were a lot more ruminants before we came here than there are today. I mean, so if you're looking for that argument, it's definitely there to be made when it comes to greenhouse gases. When it comes to the overall environment, there are a lot of benefits that bison offer the environment that cattle simply cannot. I mean, cattle have been brought here from a different environment where they also provided a lot for their environment. And there are many things that we can utilize cattle for in areas where we need domesticated animals that we can't utilize bison for, and they can do a lot of things that bison have done in the past, but they don't completely replace them. So there is a difference between the two. This article is more or less trying to draw a line on the gas emissions from the two animals, and they fail horribly at it. They first cite a 1998 study where bison were fed, and this is a dietary controlled study. They were fed sun-dried alfalfa pellets, and then they measured the methane emissions off of the bison. So we get into some of how this process of producing methane works. So ruminants have microbes in their rumen called methogens, and methogens produce methane from fermentation of feed products. The fermentation takes carbohydrates, makes them more soluble for the body. Now, the higher quality the feed is, or the higher protein content the feed has, the less fermentation takes place, right? So fermentation efficiency is really important for cattle producers, especially, also with bison producers, although bison are raised a little more hands-off. But you want the efficiency of the rumens to be working effectively. So there have been a lot of different studies that have been done over the years where they take specific types of feeds and feed them to the animals to see how it impacts the methane levels, because that also tells them how the fermentation is working within the body, how efficient the feed is being for that animal's consumption. And the more efficient an animal is able to consume and process feed, the less feed it takes. So it becomes a monetary thing, right? Because if you spend less money on feed, and in theory, you raise your profitability. So it's in everybody's best interest, right? I mean, it's in everyone's best interest to increase the efficiency of feed. So higher quality feeds reduce methane emissions. And in this case, this study only used alfalfa pellets, which are a high quality feed. So you're going to get lower emissions. You're going to get lower emissions than a cow that's just out there on the pasture, or a cow in a feedlot that isn't restricted to one dietary food. I mean, this is the big problem with this fact checker using this study. They didn't even think about the fact that it was using one type of food. So then they went a step farther and said, okay, so the bison in the study created 30 kilograms of methane per year versus the average cow, which produces 100 kilograms of methane per year. The 100 kilograms is artificially inflated. It's impossible to know what each animal is going to produce because it all depends on genetics, the rumens in their stomach, how well they're processing the food. Like I said, and when you put them on a strict dietary plan, you're going to get significantly lower results, especially if it's a high. If you put them on a plan where they were eating a food source that required a lot more fermentation to break the food down, you're going to have higher methane emissions. If you had something that was a high quality feed like alfalfa pellets, it'll lower the methane emissions from the animal. According to the National Agriculture and Food Center and the Research Institute of Animal Production, you can expect to see about 87 kilograms on average coming out of a cow. So bumping it up to 100, the writer, the fact checker, was already kind of inflating his facts a little bit. Like, we're gonna go outside the box here a little bit and try and make it sound a lot worse, because the study we have, people might pick up on the fact that it's not a great comparison. The reality is that, bison and cattle are gonna be all over the board on this. And it would also depend on where they are. Are they foraging in North Carolina on lush green grass? Are they out west where they actually have a higher protein source? You don't see a lot of grass there, but some of that grass has got a much higher level of protein than the grasses out east. All of this are contributing factors. So you can't just take one study to the next without having a direct comparison, and these studies didn't do that. They also went as far as comparing a 2021 paper which said that wild bison could have produced even less methane. So this 2021 research, number one, the researchers pointed out a lot of areas of miscalculation within their project, a lot of areas of flaws where they felt that there could be, a lot of issues with the way that they conducted their research. Number two, they didn't research wild bison. They researched a herd of bison on 5 acres of land and compared it to a feedlot, which a feedlot is feeding grains. I mean, these bison were only grass-fed. The entire study is flawed in and of itself. It was done more or less to open up a discussion and possibly intrigue the interests of investors for further research. And that's all the study did. It had a lot of flaws in its study plan, and it mentioned those flaws, as it should, as a research paper. It mentioned which flaws it thought it could have, and that opens the door for those researchers to possibly dig a little further, see where else it could go. I don't think the research paper was intended for a fact checker to use. And in fact, the fact checker did play it down a little bit, although they gave the wrong reasons for why this research report was probably inaccurate. The research report itself lists a slew of inaccuracies that have occurred during their research. And then they also mention another report, I think it was from 2012, which pretty much said, bison and cattle are about the same. So at the end of the day, you get this guy's Facebook post deleted because it's been fact-checked by fact-checkers who don't even have facts to back up their fact-checking, right? And they even went as far as implying or saying that this post implied more or was stating more. I mean, it was almost like he was getting fact-checked on what the post didn't even state, right? They're saying that he was saying that cows aren't bad don't have an impact on climate change, and bison didn't have an impact on climate change, therefore cows couldn't have an impact on climate change. In reality, bison are a keystone species, so they've impacted the ecology, the climate, everything. That's what a keystone species does. All they were saying is that they don't, you'd have to prove to them that cow farts were any worse than bison farts, and there's never been a conclusive study. And so therefore, there's nothing to fact check about what this person was saying. They weren't saying that cow farts were any better or worse. They were asking to be proven that they were any worse. But their free speech, their freedom of posting their opinion, their freedom of opening a discussion that I think is actually a fairly good and important discussion, was shut down by fact checkers that didn't even have any facts to back it up. And then these fact checkers went as far as saying, well, it's wrong because he used the word buffalo instead of bison. This is the type of world that we live in today. Anyway, be aware of these fact-checking tools and who these people are and what information they're putting out there. I'm calling this out because I feel like we need to call them out more often. And I'm not saying that everything I'm saying is correct. I'm just saying, from my knowledge, a lot of the things that they were using were either incorrect or insufficient to be fact-checking somebody and having their voice not be heard. And I am somebody who is 110% pro-bison over cattle on a lot of different things. But I also have cows myself. I raise cows. I like beef, and I understand that all ruminants have a positive impact on the environment. I might disagree with one of these climate people, but I think that everybody can agree that these animals are essential to our environment. At the end of the day, I feel like this system that's been put in place over the last couple of years needs to be shut down. And the only way it's going to shut down and go away is if we continue to call them out on it and call them on their BS and remind other people out there that these methods of persuasion, these things that people are using to shut down the free speech of independent people are wrong. They're wrong, and the guy who wrote this article, like I said, I don't blame him so much as I do USA Today, because it was just he's just doing a job, and my golly, he tried his best at it. He just couldn't find any good resources because there weren't any, and I have a problem with that. I don't like the way that some of these organizations are working these days, and I think that we just need to keep calling them out on it, even if it is something small. Even if it's just something where you almost feel like you're just being a little nitpicky. I mean, what they were doing by saying it's a bison, not a buffalo, they were nitpicking at these people. And their nitpicking was the cause, from my understanding, or at least sounded like they were trying to take credit for it, the cause of this post being removed from Facebook because it was misinformation. It was misleading. The entire USA Today article was misleading.